by introducing you to our speakers. The lead presenter today is Mr. Sukhwinder Arora. He's an OPM Associate and Director of Arora Associates Limited UK and has been team leader for the savings at the frontier. We also have with us two guest commentators, Mr. Prabhat Lab, who's Chief Executive Officer at Grameen Foundation India, and we have Mr. Gerard Kutzi, who leads our customer value team here at CGAP. My name is Emilio Hernandez. I'm part of the CGAP team leading the Evidence and Impact Project, and I'll be your facilitator today. Without further ado, I would like to ask Sukhwinder to start the presentation. Sukhwinder, the floor is yours.
Prabhat, can I request you to make some strategic comments before I start?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Sukhwinder, and thanks, Emilio. I hope I'm audible. So, savings at the frontier, as the kind of name suggests, it's not just a name. It was really about thinking about strategies and initiatives that can go to the really frontier markets in terms of most remotest places and how we can offer reliable savings services in those places. And of course, the program started in the year 2015 when I was at the Mastercard Foundation. But the background to this program, and I thought I'll share with all of you a little bit of background to how we came up to conceptualize and design this program. So it goes back to the year, I should say 2012. By that time, there was a lot of interest in the savings group space. The Gates Foundation had made, three very large investments, one with CARE, one with CRS, and one with Oxfam America. And Dean Carlin at IPA ran some randomized controlled studies on them, which showed some, extremely positive and remarkable impact of savings groups, informal groups, on the household savings and resilience. But at the same time, there was the savings groups are really powerful and they create great impact, but they are always dependent upon philanthropic funding for their scaling. And that was one concern which led to many of the donors by the year 2012, leading to almost kind of stopping or not providing any additional support to the savings groups or organizations. So that was the kind of scenario we were in 2012, and that's the time when I joined Mastercard Foundation, and there we made a couple of grants to CARE and CRS to do savings groups programming. And an interesting thing happened at that time, which was another program that I was managing at Mastercard Foundation, run by CGAP, called the MicroLead program. And MicroLead came up with a request for proposals to promote formal savings, savings programs, in which surprisingly a number of projects were proposed, in response to that call for proposals, which was about linking to savings. That was kind of unexpected but very very positive and reassuring kind of thing, which we noticed that the banks and financial service providers are interested in this space of informal savings groups, and they're looking at that as a market for their expansion. But yet the question mark was that strategy of a bank linking to groups assumes existence of such groups, and the question mark again was that, okay, who would then promote these groups, and how these groups can be promoted in a sustainable and scalable manner. So that's the kind of question mark which led us to design and conceptualize Savings at the Frontier program, in which we say that we just ask this question: can we have the private sector, whether it is banks or MNOs or technology companies, take up the mantle of not just linking to savings groups, but also forming groups on their own if that market is so promising? And we had lots of consultations at that time. Many people at Gates Foundation, at Green Mastercard Foundation, at Peak Network, Sukhwinder himself. And one remark that Sukhwinder made, which I remember, and it's great that Sukhwinder is kind of doing this webinar today, was that this kind of approach of a private sector led approach to promoting informal savings or informal savings groups sounds very promising. but we do not know who is the right entity to do that. And at best, what we can do is we can start the race without knowing, who the winner will be. And that's precisely the kind of approach we put in the design of this Savings at the Frontier program. One more thing which is worth mentioning is that how come an organization like Oxford Policy Management, came to manage this program on behalf of Mastercard Foundation, because it was not really involved with savings group or informal groups till that time so much. We realized that to run this program successfully would require an organization that not only understands the importance of savings groups, but also is somewhat detached, so that they are not really entrenched about a particular method of doing it, and they can take a more objective view, and also have the credibility and capacity to guide and mentor whoever is interested through the process of business planning and development. That's what kind of led to this design and launch of this extremely interesting program, Savings Frontier. And it's fantastic that today we are having this webinar to share some of the learning from this. Sukhwinder, over to you.
Thank you, Prabhat. That was very, very useful strategic context in which Savings at the Frontier, as you said, the frontier is in terms of where the formal meets the informal. Because even today, lots of people in all countries, especially developing countries, are outside the radar of the formal economy. And in this very, very troubling time, I'm actually reflecting on how those people are going to cope when the global economy has been shut for business. But that's another conversation for another day. But my thoughts are with the informal economy today as I speak to all of you. And thank you for joining us despite so much of turmoil in the world. So, so we set out this journey. The program was launched in November 2015 at the Savings Group Conference in Lusaka. The Savings at the Frontier works with 9 different kinds of financial services providers, 3 of which are business-to-business solutions. The program provides both technical and financial support, but the focus is on what we call a triple win. Not only are we trying to offer value to the financial services providers, but also groups and individual savers. And we define both the financial services providers. Sorry, previous slide, please. Yeah. Emilio, previous slide, please. You're going further.
Yeah, just a moment. This one?
Next one, please.
Next one. Okay.
So I should have said that, I'm going to focus my talk on 3 core themes. So if there are only 3 things you remember from this 1 hour, the 3 themes are: number 1, the people themselves, the savers themselves, are already beginning to mix the formal and the informal in a much bigger way than we seem to realize. Over 6 years of index microdata between 2011 and 2017, 7.3 million additional people are mixing formal and informal. It's very, very interesting that this increase is not coming from either those who are only using banks or other formal financial institutions, or those who are only using informal financial services. It's coming from those who are mixing and matching. The percentage of adults who were using both formal financial institutions and informal finance went up in these 3 countries from 5% to 16% over the 6 years. And what is reassuring and reconfirming is that this data from these 3 countries through Findex is also validated by the Findex data in Kenya, as well as the Finex's data, which is led by FSD Kenya, as well as our own conversations and studies in the 3 focus countries. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, we're working with 9 different types of formal financial institutions in these 3 countries. 3 of these are business-to-business solutions, and we are seeking to focus on, as Prabhat laid out for us, in the call for proposals and the subsequent arrangement. We are looking for a commercial model, but we have then, defined it that, it has to be a triple win to work. Triple win for the FSPs, for the groups, and the individual savers. And this is where I think SatF has gone beyond traditional linkage models, because a lot of linkage so far when we started was all about a bank account for the group. While that can do some good to the group, uh, lots of things what the poor people want to do is not amenable to just that link. And so therefore what we are looking at is, can the linkage with the group also open up financial services opportunities for the individual savers? And inshallah, in over time, as digitalization grows, can it also open up opportunities for the non-members, non-savers in the group, who can also use this digital link between the bank and the group to do transactions? That's for the future. So we took a very flexible approach. We had a lot of debate whether this is a challenge fund, whether this is, shared funding. What is SatF? And we, you know, many of our team members had worked on challenge funds before, and we quickly concluded that we are not a challenge fund. We are not going to run races with, you know, similar starting points, similar running time. So we allowed the formal financial institutions to walk or run, and not only on one track. Different tracks were allowed. So they could try. For example, in the business plan development phase, they could do research, they could do pilot, they could do action research, they could get a consultant to help them think through what they had been doing so far and how does that change. So the whole focus was on adaptive engagement with the financial services staff, not only with the CEOs, but even more so with the middle management, to identify what was happening inside the organization, and see how we could understand and drive the change by working with internal champions. And we have gone for 3-stage approval process. So starting with a smaller commitment of about up to $100,000 for business plan development phase. Based on that, a full 2 to 3 year implementation of up to $1 million grant, and then super tranches for those who perform well in the race. Next slide, please. This is something which SatF is quite proud of, in terms of formalizing this two-way conversation, adaptive relationship into a two-way promise card, where we recognize the commitment by both parties in terms of funding, results, reporting, data handling, and also learning. And keeping the conversation always on, how do we build a commercial business case and delivery to not only the groups but also users, and then structuring the promise card into 4 tranches, but the initial 2 are focused on activity, taking up 50 to 60% of the total commitment, which largely talks about staffing, training, basic changes in infrastructure, additional infrastructure required, plugins to the core banking, etc. And the last 2 tranches, 40 to 50%, payable on outcomes. Account opened, but not only opened, but some of the payments are linked directly to subsequent account activity. We are acutely conscious of 20 to 30% activity rates in the mobile money in Africa over the last 7-10 years. And then the promise card very quickly directly is related to that particular institution with which we are negotiating. So which includes issues around timelines, take up, customer affordability, difficulties for FSPs to negotiate, especially when transactions are low and you're still looking at the future. but the MNs are looking at your current scale and scope, and so therefore negotiating very hard, and the current transaction values may work for mobile money remittances, but may not work for small regular savings. And so therefore, can we think of short-term savings subsidies to move towards realistic transaction fees at steady state? Next slide, please. So this is how the race is ongoing. The DSS, which is SatF partner in Ghana, has moved towards the end of tranche 4. Two banks, TPB and Equity, are moving towards tranche 4, and others are catching up. Next slide, please. So let's focus a bit more on the lessons. What are the emerging lessons? As I said, 1/3 of the program time is still remaining. I studied in economics that which talked a lot about first mover advantage, and having done SATF and quite a few other evaluations, I'm quite clear that first movers also have lots of disadvantage, especially when the business case is untested. It's very hard to go to your senior management and say, give us $500,000, when there is no data to show that this $500,000 can generate 20% or 10% or 30% internal rate of return. It's very hard to anticipate and plan for all the risks when the regulatory space is not fully clear. It's very hard if you don't know how the customers are going to respond to a product like this. So when the business case is unproven, especially savings-led credit linkages, not credit-led, but savings-led linkages between FSPs and ISMs and users. So we were quite clear that the FSPs need short-term risks and costs, but we were equally clear that money on its own cannot be the solution, because money does not change behavior. It might get us tactical space, but it cannot change corporate priorities, especially for some of our large partners. And so therefore, what we thought a lot about, how do we identify what are the internal FSP champions, how do we facilitate internal change, what are the triggers in our toolbox which can help. Obviously, arguments, evidence, increasing FSP's own stakes in terms of contribution to the project, in terms of how they were changing their internal infrastructure in terms of staff, in terms of reallocation of infrastructure, for example, core banking, in terms of start using the data that is emerging to have a two-way conversation to understand revised strategy, and not just get stuck on the blueprint which was signed in year 1900. Next slide, please. Facilitating innovation is hard, and that's why it doesn't happen all the time, because there are so many things which fall between the cracks. We need multiple building blocks, and even more difficult, alignment across these. If the staff training is not linked to the core system, that training has very little impact. Similarly, if the staff training is not linked to their incentives and alignment, in terms of, for example, the branch is being monitored on indicators which focus much more on how much credit given rather than how many accounts are active, then obviously we need to have alignment across different aspects of the bank to really be effective and to create opportunities for possible innovation. And then, of course, watching constantly between what the FSP is offering and how the customers are responding to that, both through data as well as conversations with the customers. And as I said earlier, implementation plans need to be flexible to readjust to FSP level strategic changes as well as the wider changes in the market. And actually, for this presentation, I've created quite a few annexes slide, which will not be shown in the webinar, but as soon as you have the link to the slides, you'll be able to see quite a lot of material in the annexes, and one of the annexes on how much of change has happened in Ghanaian financial sector, where more than 400 financial institutions, including universal banks, savings and loans associations, savings and loan companies, microfinance institutions have lost their license, and what kind of impact it has on remaining financial institutions as well as on the savers, you can all imagine. So you need to constantly watch what's going on internally within the FSP as well as outside. For example, one of our partners had a change of CEO. So that itself changes then, the strategic priorities internally, the conversations taking place at the executive committee, etc., etc. Since the SATF was focused so much on sharing, developing, and sharing learning, we try to facilitate safe forums where financial services providers would talk amongst themselves. But even we were pleasantly surprised to what extent the partners were willing to talk to each other, and it was very interesting that in some of the conversations we were having, the length, the depth of the conversations that were going on, and in fact, at some places, I remember one of the FSPs was responding to another FSP saying, "I'm not going to give you my commercial secrets away, but just stopping short of that, there was quite a frank conversations on all the challenges, even in the same market, and how the community of financial service providers could assess that." And I remember talking to Pam Eser on UNCDF when she was running microlead, and they had similar kind of experience. So despite competition, I think we underestimate how much FSPs are willing to talk to each other. And then SATF, talked about facilitating market-based market FSP responses. So in especially in Tanzania, we have three large partners. We're expecting competition will emerge, but that's based on market-based solutions that the FSPs are providing, rather than you know we either facilitating or obstructing that competition. Next slide, please. Now, before we go into the set of slides around customers, I want you to do a 1-minute thought experiment. If somebody had come to us last year, a scientist, and said, "Oh, I've got an antivirus which can solve a global problem and save trillions, not millions, not billions, but trillions of dollars," we would have not taken that person seriously. The point is, it's very, very hard to create counterfactuals. And another counterfactual that I would like to visually place before you is a poor person who is standing at the edge of a cliff. And one small misstep, and that person could fall deep into the valley. Now, helping that person to come from that precipice to a more secure ground, how do you put a value to that? And I think we as a community have really underestimated the value of good quality financial inclusion, partly because we don't have the tools to capture it. And my personal view is that for flexible saving services, we should listen more and more to what people are saying and what people are doing. And also, be very, very clear that between opening a bank account and making changes in life and livelihood, there's a long, non-linear results chain. Very, very long, non-linear, complex result chain. And we could get lost and entangled in trying to capture this. No RCT can capture this because this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. And we are talking about marginal changes, slowly changing the trajectory of where people will be in 3-5 years time, not in 3 days or 3 weeks. So we decided that we need to focus much more on changes in results, in changes in behavior and attitudes. Next slide, please. Most of you on the webinar will be able to recognize this because you see it every day in terms of your discussions. But the point I was making in terms of helping from the edge of the cliff so that they don't fall over, has very little impact seen from a static perspective, but is very powerful. It's like having a virus or not having a virus in today's condition. Poor people are constantly battling irregular flows of income and expenditure. Their expenditure is often certain, but the to deal with it, and it's also fluctuating. Sometimes they might get $1 a day, sometimes they might get $1 a week, sometimes they might get $100 in a month. And of course, if the global shutdown is there, they might not get any dollars anytime soon. They also, like us, want to invest in opportunities, and then of course receive and make payments, and then getting ready for planned events. My daughter is going to get married in 2 years' time. I need to send my son to school or work. And then how do we get FSPs to design accessible, usable product which can help them answer all these needs? No single product will be able to do it, but poor people, if they have a multitude of products, then they can mix and adjust according to their own needs. Next, please. So, so we see this as a aspiration for a demand pull, where the customers, can move from what I call customer acquisition to customer delight. I either use the product so much and they like it so much that, not only they're pulling their friends and family and neighbors, and we have seen lots of examples of this. For example, M-Pesa seems the most well talked about in the financial inclusion space. But of course, we have other examples like Uber, Facebook, where you've gone from, supply push to demand push, demand pull. But I think a lot of financial inclusion efforts today are still supply push rather than demand pull. And how do we reach from supply push to demand pull is a conversation for all of us. And I've given in the in the slide some examples of how we can track, are we moving from supply push to demand pull. Next slide, please. So as I said, we track evidence of changes in financial decision making and behavior of customers, and we do that in 2-3 ways. Here I talk about the independent study which has been commissioned by SatF through Bath Social and Development Research, and they have already visited one partner in Ghana, and last month they were with 2 partners in Tanzania. So we are still compiling, but we share some emerging findings from these. We will be distilling these and sharing more widely once we have the results fully tabulated. So it's a 3-year longitudinal study to explore use of financial products and platforms for both groups and users, and also how the staff and agents are relating with the customers. And for business to business models, how is the relationship, the feedback emerging between, especially between the supplier of the backend services and the frontline financial services providers, which is actually delivering financial services to the customers. And focusing a lot on short-term outcomes. I'm also always reminded of Milton Keynes, I think, who said, in the long term, we're all dead. Changes in attitudes, perceptions, behavior. In any case, the projects are often dead before the full impacts are realized. Adoption and use. Next slide, please. Emilio, next slide. As I said earlier, it's quite difficult to fully track customer level track outcomes, and it's becoming even more interesting and challenging because customers are beginning to have relationships with multiple financial services providers, are mixing formal and the informal, changing providers, and also are using multiple different products. Next slide, please.
Just a reminder, you've got 6 minutes left, Sukhwinder.
Thank you. Yes, I think I'm good. Thanks. So this is now 2 examples. Again, you will have the slides, and you can look at them in slower time later. And this is just to so we go to our providers, sit with them, and try and map out how they are engaging. For example, DSS Ghana is a B2B solution, so DSS Ghana works with enterprises who in turn offer Susu collection services in Accra and other places, and are working on a VSLA version also. So this is what we get from the supply side. And then, yes, next slide. Yes, please, next slide. And this is what we get in terms of the demand side, where our Bath team actually goes and talks to informally talks to different customers and recipients of B2B services, and then provides us feedback. And it's very interesting that because of different changes happening in the sector, both at the Susu collection level as well as the Ghanaian wider financial sector, 2 Susu enterprises consulted both stated that they wouldn't have been in business without the introduction of the digital solution. And they talked, they gave lots of examples of how this B2B solution is supporting them. Next slide, please. Emilio, next slide, please. For the Susu customers, this is very, very interesting in terms of the informal feedback. We ex ante thought that digitization is going to offer lots of solutions, and so therefore is going to be lapped up by the customers. For example, we all talk about transparency, and yet when some of the customers started getting text messages confirming the money deposited that day or that minute with the collector, some of them said, please don't send me the message because this causes some challenges for me, because I don't want other people to be able to see my phone and see how much money I've accumulated. Or the fact that trust does not come from digitization. It comes from a proven track record. And we have seen that when banks or institutions fail, the fact that I have a passbook doesn't mean that I can get the money. Although the central bank might announce that that money is accessible. Next slide, please. This is another example again of what we did in terms of sitting down with our partner in Equity Bank Tanzania, in terms of how they see the relationship between the financial services provider and the customers, and the processes of engagement. And the next slide, please, which shows. Emilio, next slide, please. Yes. So this is the emerging findings from the Bath team's direct conversations with selected customers. And again, some of the themes were expected and some were quite surprising. For example, safety of funds, we heard a lot about right from the start of the SatF, because that was a big issue and it's becoming a bigger issue, especially before share out, when the money in the groups is quite substantial, and the treasurers and others in the group really have sleepless nights about it. Agency and confidence, the groups provide a lot of agency, but building a relationship need not need not weaken that agency, but in fact, engaging with the bank staff and bank staff and trainers, helps them, feel safe in the environment of the saving group, because there are a number of people in the group, and some people understand things more than others. So so they can see how they're smarter group members and others are able to engage with the bank and feel that what is the potential value of the engagement. Access to other financial products, we heard quite some examples through this study. This one, the fourth bullet, is very interesting in terms of reinforcement of messages. Just like all of us, we see different sources of messages, and then we begin to reinforce those. So here also, bank engagement, building on some of the messages from NGO staff, the government. For example, in Tanzania, government has made quite a lot of efforts in terms of registration of the groups. So government staffs are also engaging. So different avenues, if they're reinforcing messages that. But the key point, which was in SATF strategy, and increasingly we want to focus on, is choice. So increasing competition between the formal and the informal, and amongst the formal, increases choice for informal savers, and they can constantly assess whether the mattress is better than the group, vice versa, and whether the group is providing me services which the group bank cannot do, and why, how can they build on each other and switch as well as complement. Next slide, please. So this is very early days. This is just a slide because we were having this webinar. We are still working through this, but we are beginning to see some patterns. Parallel savers, those who are beginning to save both with the group and also have individual account. For example, in case of Equity Bank Tanzania, we also saw that actually they're beginning to roll out loans to some of the groups and their members, and actually direct loans from the bank to the members are doing better and more popular than the direct loans from the bank to the group. The top of focus, where the predominant focus is on transaction within the group, and then whatever excess liquidity, excess cash is there, that is transmitted to the bank account. And then when the time comes to give a loan, if the if the money in the cash box in the group is short, checks can be issued to the members. We also have reluctant adopters who are watching other members and deciding whether to take the jump in terms of increasing their engagement with the bank. And then some of the early adopters who are feeling confident enough to send even group contribution from the mobile wallet, their personal mobile wallet, to the group bank account. Next slide, please. I'll quickly close these lessons. So ISMs offered a lot of economic and social value, but also have rigidity and limitations. We can talk about that subsequently after the webinar. If anybody is interested, we can talk about that. But FSPs and ISMs on its own may not be enough. So therefore, what I was talking about, opening up the linkage agenda much wider than just an account between the group and the bank. And we've just been talking about a concept. It's very early days in terms of you looking at the group as a customer sandbox, where in a safe environment, groups members can build on each other's expertise, skills, confidence, and test out different things, test out different products, see a few people can try and say, this works. It's not as complicated as I thought. And then, as I said, future potential for converting cash into digital, not only for members, but even for non-members in the community. Next slide, please. To offer saving services, there are lots of trade-offs. Some of these trade-offs, savers are also quite well aware of. Convenience, ease, and cost of access. Customers want flexibility and rigidity. I mean, they want to lock in some money and they want other money to be available at very short notice. There are, of course, trade-offs between risk and returns, anonymity, predictability. So we as supporters of financial services providers need to work with them to better understand what the savers are saying, but more importantly, what the savers are doing. And then how do we create bundles which can be then picked up by the savers? I think that's the last one. Thank you. Next slide, please, just to show for a second, and then over to Gerard. So this is where our contact details are there if anybody wants to get in touch. As I said, when these slides are shared by CGAP, there are quite a few slides after this slide, which are the annexes slide, where we have provided a lot of evidence and data, which you might want to look at after the seminar. And if you have any issues, please join the SatF mailing list. Feel free to get in touch with me or Janet, or reach out to our webpage of the OPM website to look at more material. Over to Harold. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sukhwinder. Great presentation, and it's very glad. I'm very glad to see an active engagement between our guest speakers and the audience. We will move now to some comments and reflections of what Sukhwinder has presented us, coming from Gerard. Gerard, are you with us?
Thank you, Emilio. I'm right here. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, Prabhat and Sukhwinder. Thank you, Emilio, for facilitating this webinar. It is important learning for all of us because this is a topic that we have been looking at from many angles over many years. When I was approached to serve on the GIC, or the Global Investment Committee of Savings at the Frontier, I started out being concerned about the value that members and ISMs can gain from private sector involvement. And I was sort of a pessimist on that, because I felt that if you consider existing groups and the IRRs that they often achieve over a complete cycle, and you bring a bank or a private sector firm into that equation, then that returns move to the private sector firm, and you may find the problem with the within the savings groups. Although I think it is a valid view to be a little bit sort of cautious here, I'm also now thinking it's a little bit of a narrow view, and I think we should consider the following in this cautious approach. Firstly, SatF applies 3 levels of value. So they want to ensure with every action, every project, every funding arrangement, that there are value for the members of the groups, the ISMs and the FSPs. And they are very strict about that in considering applications and assessing business cases and business plans. Another important point is that these informal savings mechanisms or groups are defined far wider than conventional definitions. Sukhwinder referred to the Susu collectors in Ghana. And as you all know, Susu collectors collect from a portfolio of clientele, which in this instance is also defined as a savings group, quote unquote. There are other interesting examples as well, and I'll leave that to Sukhwinder to elaborate on should we have time. SatF also invested in more than just the linkages. They looked at the ecosystem to decrease price points for all the bank systems that institutions used or are using, and they made sure that everybody were focused on how do you deliver products at very, very low price points to accommodate the poverty levels of people participating in these savings groups. Some projects considered cost reduction in the systems. Some looked at income generation activities of members and linked value chains in agriculture, for example, with what the savings groups are doing and how they are approached. And then FSPs have also become much more proactive, starting new groups by themselves, promoting groups, or facilitating the emergence of digital groups. An example is in Koba, that is implemented by Tanzanian Postal Bank. In addition, SatF spends a lot of time on change management within the FSPs. And that is an extremely important point, because a lot of these institutions suffer from exactly the same problem that many projects suffer, is that we have these bright ideas, wonderful plans, but to get it implemented in an institution, especially large institutions, is extremely difficult. And that change management process is so important. Another important consideration is the two-way promise card system that Sukhwinder mentioned. And then we have a funder, Mastercard Foundation, that proved to be flexible, willing to learn, and pragmatic. At this stage, we see 2 to 3 of the financial service providers with real promise to make this work to the benefit of all. Unsurprisingly, it is 2 larger entities that can learn at scale, and 1 entity that are small, hands-on, and very innovative. And the bottom line is that this is not a battle won yet, so to speak. This is a proof of concept, a learning process, and as such, an adaptive process as we go along. We have not conclusively proved anything yet. Time will tell us where this will go. But my assessment is that there are some green shoots that look promising here, and we should learn from that. I look forward to the end of the project and the learning that can be shared, and this webinar is obviously part of that sharing. And I'm sure that Sukhwinder and Prabhat stands ready to answer questions. Just to mention that Sam Mendelsohn posted the link on the European Microfinance Award in the chat box. If you are interested, you can have a look at that, because the emphasis is on savings for their next round. So, Emilio, those are my short observations. It leaves a few minutes for maybe answering some of the questions, or maybe another question. Over to you.
Thank you, just in time. Thank you for those very valuable highlights that you made, Gerard. We now have moved into our question and answer session. We've been receiving questions all along. Thank you for that. We're going to start with the first question that, for Sukhwinder and perhaps Prabhat may want to also comment on this. One of the questions says, how do we sustain savings drives among people in developing countries when these countries lack general purpose insurance products to protect livelihood assets? Saving products tend to be coping mechanism for shocks rather than savings for investment. I think the question gets at, the interrelationship between savings and insurance, and how the lack of insurance may favor or disfavor savings. Any comments, Sukhwinder, on this?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I would like to make a few points on that. I remember when I was researching with Stuart Rutherford for the poor and the money in India and South Asia, when we used to go and talk to some of the senior regulators and other policymakers, they will say, oh, poor people are too poor and they cannot save. And then after 2 years of research, we concluded poor people are too poor and they have no choice but to save. Because they know that, planned and unplanned expenditures are coming. And the only way they can deal with those is by saving. Now, poor people save in different ways. And, if you look at the poor and the money, you'll see that we call loans as savings against future. So this is cash flow against future saving, so, because, ultimately they have to pay it out of their savings, because some poor people, and more so since we did that research, are lucky enough to get some handout from government, but most of them have to fend off on their own. For example, the developing world today is announcing so many packages for workers, businesses, etc. But most developing countries don't have the fiscal space to give support when the whole global economy has been shut down. So first point I want to make is poor people are too poor not to save. So the overall saving rate may be different across economies, but poor people have to save. Now, they may not always save in ways we recognize. They save, for example, in terms of entitlement. I give you some money today because you read it, and tomorrow I have the entitlement and I will get that money. So that's one way of saving. Some of the people, convert their savings into goats or utensils or other things because, the formal financial institutions, have high transaction fees and low returns. How can a fixed deposit in a bank compete with a goat which will give a much higher return even though there is a risk of there? And also in terms of the uh, and this is return net of transaction costs are even more comparable. So poor people may be poor, but they are not stupid. Most of them make very, very wise choices. The last point I would like to make is that for most poor people, insurance is saving because they do not have access to insurance products which work for them. So the primary insurance product is the savings that they are able to, draw on. And as I said, savings broadly defined, not narrowly defined as we understand it. Not just cash savings, but in-kind savings, entitlement savings, etc., etc. And then
Great.
taking a loan to be, to dip into future savings.
Thank you. There's another question, very practical one, that says whether the fact that saving apps require an Android phone and internet services, is this a discouragement for people to poor people to digitize? And the software that uses USSD services comes with, sometimes poor delivery service. How did you manage those challenges? Also, sometimes the fees that are charged by service providers are still very high for some of the customers that these groups work with. What are your comments on those challenges?
That's right. Poor people many of them do not yet have, smartphones. But the smartphone penetration is rising faster than we expected, much faster. And I think this global lockdown over the last 1 week is going to will give further push to digitization, just like the post Kenya election violence gave a big spurt to M-Pesa take up in Kenya when M-Pesa was launched. But on the other hand, as a community, we have huge challenges in terms of financial and numeracy literacy, in terms of data protection laws, in terms of familiarity with technology. But the group, as I said, provides a sandbox for a customer to try out some of these things. For example, if the 2 or 3 smart people in the group first start, using a smartphone and are able to then help other members to, to to transact. For example, we have seen through our partner Emergent in Ghana that they also provide a B2B solution, and some of their customers who do not even have phones, forget about smart or a dumb phone, they don't have phones and they are using their friend's phone to transact. And Emergent is offering that facility. And so experimentation is on, but as Harad said, we are far from declaring victory. We are not anywhere near the summit, but we hope we have started the climb.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions. Another one coming here. Could you speak more about the experience of working with a flexible funder? How much Mastercard Foundation was helpful in supporting the implementation of the project? And any recommendations that this experience, particularly for funders, can provide in terms of how to structure, how much flexible you should be when you have this type of projects?
I think it was all this what SCTF has been able to do would have been impossible without a patient, understanding, and a very flexible funder. that Mastercard proved in the partnership. And this was a two-way partnership, and it took some time for the SatF team to realize what they mean. We were initially thinking this was micromanagement. They were trying to ask too many questions, of detail, but then it took us some time to realize that actually, what they were trying to do was, just be a informed participant, informed partner to make sure that, we had thought through all the questions that we might face in the future. So, and I think that's the way to go in terms of, partnership. It has to be adaptive, flexible, listening, and jointly reviewing, rather than having some kind of hierarchy where, just the money speaks and experience on evidence does not.
Perhaps this is our last question, given the time that we have. It's related to that. The question is, can you say more on how agreements are structured to ensure flexibility and accountability between project managers, the funder, and the FSPs that are participating? How do you formalize that flexibility?
Yeah, so we have a negotiated promise card between SatF and the financial services providers. The financial services providers, take this quite seriously. This goes through 10, 12 iterations, initially starting with the operational team, going to the CEO, executive committee, and in our team also, there's a lot of discussion, used to be a lot of discussion on this. And these promise cards were then shared, the draft promise cards were shared with GIC also to see, so that the governing and investment committee could see, where the specific projects were going. And since Mastercard, had 2 seats on the GIC table, they were able to look at it both as oversight, but also as part of the decision-making process.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, there are many more questions that I would encourage you to send directly to the authors. You have their emails in the actual presentation. I thank all of you for your very active engagement. We hope this seminar gave you some interesting ideas to think about and explore in your own work. Certainly did for us here at CGAP. And just to thank you again for participating, and remind you that this webinar, the recording of the webinar, will be available in a CGAP event site, and the actual presentation with the annexes that Sukhwinder mentioned will be available also for download. Thank you very much again. Thank you, Sukhwinder. Thank you, Prabhat. Thank you, Gerard, for your participation. And thank you all for joining us. Until next time. Have a great day.
Everyone, part of this.